Welcome back to the Explanation Pro. Today I'll recap a drama, thriller film called Return to Sender. Spoilers incoming. In Texas, Johnny Decker, a man on death row, types one last letter to a man named Frank. He is being prepared for execution and is given one last meeting with his lawyer, to whom he gives the letter to give to Frank. Decker is then executed via an electric chair. The letter reaches Frank, and it turns out that Johnny Decker isn't the only one who has been writing to him. There are several other inmates with whom he has been in correspondence. Frank meets with Mark and hands him Decker's letter, which Mark reads out loud, to which he says that the letter will cost him $30,000. It's revealed that Frank is using the inmates' letters for financial gain. Afterward, Frank pulls out another letter, this time from a woman named Charlotte Corey, who's on death row in the state of Oklahoma, and writes that she wants to meet him. Mark says the letter he has from her would cost $500,000. That evening, Frank calls Charlotte. She asks if he has her recent letter, to which Frank apologizes regarding her sentence. Charlotte says that she has put Frank on her visitors list and asks him if he could come and meet her. He is reluctant to meet her and makes the excuse of having something else to do, prior to which Charlotte says she has to go and proceeds to hang up on him. One morning, Frank wakes up to the sound of Mark banging on his door. Mark tells him that he hasn't been answering his calls, to which Frank replies that Charlotte has stopped writing to him after being in correspondence with him. Mark says they need the last letter before Charlotte's time is up, explaining that Frank has to keep her writing to him, saying that they have been building circulation for the whole set of letters but that they would need Charlotte's last letter. Frank decides to meet Charlotte and drives to Oklahoma to meet her. Upon arriving at the prison where Charlotte is held, Frank meets Charlotte's attorney, Susan Kennan, who asks if they have met before since he looks familiar to her, to which he replies no. Afterward, Susan says that Frank's correspondence with Charlotte has really kept her going despite being sentenced to death. Frank is escorted through hallways and corridors within the prison. While sitting on his side of the bars, Charlotte is escorted into the visitors area. Frank and Charlotte finally meet, and she apologizes for not looking presentable. Charlotte goes on to tell Frank that he looks nothing like the man she imagines writing those letters. Charlotte tells Frank that she's received a lot of letters over the course of her 7-year imprisonment, ranging from guys who want to marry her, to psychiatrists who want to study her to know what made her so messed up, and people cursing at her. She tells Frank that he tried to do none of those things, that his letters were soulful, that she thought of him as truthful, and that she felt that they were on the same wavelength. Frank says that he felt it too. After leaving the prison, Frank drives to Charlotte's abandoned and boarded up house and breaks in. Frank plants a child's shoe and a doll. That same night, Frank watches the news, which states that the police received an anonymous tip about the items found in Charlotte's house with the words "the innocent die and the guilty live." Charlotte Corey is a blood sacrifice. Frank visits Charlotte again, who asks him if he's seen what's on the news and tells him that she doesn't want him to feel sorry for her. Frank tells her a story about his days as a deployed soldier under her father's command and his experiences in war. But this is all a lie. He is making this up since he has never been in the army. Charlotte asks Frank in return if he believes that there is an afterlife, to which Frank responds that he doesn't know. Afterward, Charlotte asks Frank to find her sister, saying that she always wanted her to come back and live with her and their grandma. When the visit is over, Frank meets with Susan Kennan, Charlotte's attorney, and explains the Corey's family history, that the sisters were wild, that Stella, Charlotte's sister, had been in a car accident, went blind, and ended up hating Charlotte. Frank asks Susan where to find Stella, who replies that Stella met someone and ended up changing her name and starting a new life. Frank is persistent in asking Susan where he could find Stella, but she says that he can't, saying that her uncle hired a private detective to try and find her but without any success. Susan tells Frank that it was Charlotte at the wheel during the accident, and he tells her to check with Charlotte's insurance company to see if there are any claims against her policy. That way, they could start tracking down Stella. Frank meets Susan again on the side of the road, miles away from the prison. She tells him that someone did have a claim, not Stella but a Julie Smith. He asks if there's an address available, to which Susan says there is one, a school for the blind in Muskogee. Frank travels to the school for the blind and meets Martin North, Julie's partner, who's also blind. Frank tells Martin that he has a letter for Julie from Charlotte, and the latter takes him to Julie. Frank meets Stella, who says she doesn't want the letter, stating that it's too late for her and Charlotte to reconcile. She tells Frank that he'll have to be the one to hold Charlotte's hand when she dies, since she can't. Frank apologizes but leaves them his number before leaving. Frank pays Charlotte a visit to inform her of what happened with Stella and to deliver the bad news. Charlotte says that she knew it wouldn't work out. She goes on to tell Frank how the accident happened. Charlotte was into all kinds of drugs and booze and had a boyfriend in the car while she was driving, making out with him in the front seat with Stella in the back. Charlotte, not paying attention to the road, crashes into a tree, and Stella loses her sight. Mark calls Frank to tell him that they could get $600,000 for the letters, but there's something going on with Frank, who's in a hurry to hang up but not before saying that he's trying to keep a low profile. On the side of the road, Frank is picked up by Susan after his car engine doesn't start. Susan asks if Charlotte has shared with Frank the details of the crime she committed, to which Frank says no. Susan deduces Charlotte's actions as protecting someone else, an old lover who got away with the ransom money, to which Frank asks if Charlotte is that loyal to somebody, and Susan answers that she thinks so. They arrive at the Hammonds. Susan explains that the shoe might give Charlotte a life sentence, at least if it's proven to be the baby's shoe. Frank thinks it's ridiculous and that it might even be a hoax. Inside the house, the pair meet Joe Hammond, and police officials give him the shoe to identify. Joe says he isn't sure and asks for his wife to come in, who also doesn't identify the shoe as real. Joe tells everyone to leave, and Frank and Susan do so with haste. Susan drops Frank at his motel, and suddenly she bursts into tears, telling him that she can't believe she did that to the Hammonds. Frank tries to comfort her, saying that she needs to give it a shot. After Susan has calmed down, she tells him that she has Charlotte's old suitcase, which Charlotte wants him to have. In his motel room, Frank reads the letter Charlotte wrote to Stella. After reading the letter, Frank is attacked by two hooded men. During his visit to Charlotte, she asks Frank if he's seeing anyone, and he tells her he isn't. She makes a hickey on her right arm, saying that it's for him and that she wants him to think of her that night and that she'll also be thinking about him. Charlotte asks if he dreams about her, to which he replies that he does. In that way, Frank arrives at the motel, where he meets Bonnie, a cop who says he's been asked to babysit him by Susan after the incident with the two hooded men. In his motel room, Frank opens the suitcase that Charlotte left him and finds two VHS tapes, which he plays. In one of the tapes, he identifies Joe Hammond as making out with Charlotte. Frank and Mark are on the phone with each other. Frank says that he's beginning to think that there's something else to Charlotte's case than what was known before. Mark is stubbornly convinced that Charlotte killed Hammond's daughter. Frank tells him that he has always picked cases where the inmate dies a slam dunk and says that this isn't one of them. Mark says that Charlotte's case could get them $800,000. Susan is in the governor's office to appeal for Charlotte. As she's flipping through a magazine, she comes across an article with Frank's picture on it, identifying him as a defense attorney who has been suspended for misconduct. She then calls someone to find out everything she can about Frank Nitsch, who has been posing as Frank Walsh. Frank leaves the motel room to check out and drives away. His car breaks down, and with nothing else to do, he looks through old newspaper clippings that he has collected over the years and finds an article concerning Charlotte and a piece of evidence. Frank calls Susan, saying that it's Stella that Charlotte is trying to protect, but instead of a welcome, he is confronted by Susan about his true identity. They both arrive at the prison since it's Charlotte's last day, with Susan reaching her first. Charlotte asks Frank for one last favor, that she be cremated since she ran out of money. When Frank and Susan leave, he asks her why she didn't tell Charlotte about his true identity, to which she replies that it's because Charlotte likes him and that she shouldn't lose him just because he's a liar. Frank and Susan go for a drink where Frank talks about his past days as a lawyer. Susan is weary of him knowing about his agenda of writing to inmates on death row and selling their letters to the highest bidder. Only then does Susan realize that he also planted the shoe and the doll in Charlotte's old house. Frank doesn't defend himself. Rather, he tells her about Hammond and his affair with Charlotte. Later that night, Frank and Susan go over to her house and discuss Charlotte's case files and documents over the years. Susan says that Charlotte needs a miracle, and they have one last look at the files. Susan wakes up the next morning while Frank is still going over the documents. Frank calls Stella but can't reach her. Later, when he arrives at the school for the blind, cops and an ambulance are all over the place, and Frank learns that Stella committed suicide from one of the residents of the school. Shocked to learn this, he leaves. Charlotte is shouting for Susan or anyone who would listen to her, and her shrink arrives to listen. Frank and Susan arrive in the prison, and she reports to him that Charlotte pleaded innocent, which is common for death row inmates, but since she's calmed down, she doesn't want to tell her story, nor does she want the shrink to say it out loud. Charlotte tries to make up her own story, but Frank calls her out on her bluff, telling her that he knows about Joe Hammond and that she targeted Hammond because he was just as responsible for crashing the car that blinded Stella since he was the guy she was making out with in the car. She says that she got rid of the baby's body, but Frank once again calls her out, saying he knows that Stella died, so there's no need for her to be covering up for her. Charlotte starts telling the real story. She saw the news about what happened to Hammond's baby and that the ransom was paid. Later that day she gets a call from Stella, who tells her to get rid of her car. So, Charlotte drives over to Muskogee, thinking that she might talk her sister into giving up the baby. She goes on to say that she owed it to cover up for her sister since she took everything from her. Frank goes into a rage, saying she didn't kill the baby herself and that she should tell the truth instead of going ahead with the death sentence. Charlotte says that no judge would believe him without any proof. She goes on to say that the only thing she'll miss is the moon when it's pink in the early morning. She's at peace with dying because of this alone. In prison, Charlotte writes one final letter to Frank while he goes over all the notes and files on her case in Susan's apartment while playing one of the VHS tapes. Frank then notices that Martin North is looking straight at the camera. He immediately calls Susan, who believes that there is nothing to be done, but Frank insists that they try with the help of Bonnie, who's watching over Susan's apartment. Frank and Bonnie travel to Muskogee, where the latter hands over Stella's clothes to Martin. Martin walks through a door and is visited by a little girl. The little girl sees Frank by the door and asks if he's lost. Instead of answering, she asks how old she is, and Frank then remarks that she looks so much like her little brother. It turns out that the little girl herself is the missing Hammond daughter, Kirsty. Martin is spooked and takes Kirsty out the door, while Frank tries to catch up to them by going outside but finds himself trapped inside. Martin gets a shotgun and ammo and tries to catch up to Frank, and a cat and mouse chase begins. After Martin explains to Frank his motives for the kidnapping, Martin is shot in the back by Bonnie. Kirsty is found by Frank, who takes her to Hammond's ranch and gives her to her parents. Her parents aren't sure she is their daughter, so Frank suggests they do a blood test right away. Susan appears outside of Charlotte's jail cell, telling her that her death sentence has been postponed and that there is new evidence that could get her pardoned. Charlotte is released from prison and returns to her family's home, which has been vandalized over the years. She holds up a photo of herself and Stella laughing about old times. Later, she sits on the swing, looking over the horizon, when Frank arrives on her driveway. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and also subscribe my channel for more videos like this. See you in the next video.